Marcus, and I am the director of the Community Immigration Law Placement Clinic and the Immigration Law Clinic here at the J.T. Rogers College of Law, and also co-director of the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy Program. And she probably decided for another co-director as of this week. We have a nice mix of students and faculty and community members here. So thank you. Thank you guys all for coming. And I'm glad that the in-person talk is making a comeback. There's no Zoom here today. So before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank the hardworking staff, if they all gone, of the clinics. There is Carol Lee Taylor, Rina Mendez, and Socorro Alderete, and they coordinate the lunch and flyers and help with putting publicity and things like that. So thank you to them. I just have your thank you, Carol. Thank you. You're wonderful. You're welcome. So we actually have two speakers. This is the third time in 3 years running that we have had the good fortune to hear from Iván Espinoza-Madrigal, the executive director of the Boston-based Lawyers for Civil Rights. He has sort of adopted us as his home-based law school, and every time he comes out to the border, we get a talk and an update on what's going on in the big cities. So this is awesome, and I hope it continues. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights works with communities of color and immigrants to fight discrimination and foster equity. They do it through litigation, education, and economic empowerment. So during the Trump era, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights filed the first lawsuit in the country to protect sanctuary cities, to help to save temporary protected status for Central Americans and Haitian immigrants, to block immigration arrests in courthouses, and reunite children who are separated by the federal government from their parents at the border. During the pandemic, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights worked with community partners to secure the release of people who are at a particular immigration detention facility who were at risk of infection and death, and after that successful case, the facility was shut down. And last year, based on their investigative research and collaboration with the Florence Project, those two organizations sued Customs and Border Patrol and Department of Homeland Security for failing to produce records on how humanitarian parole requests for people stuck at the border were being handled. And that, I understand, is ongoing. Maybe we'll have a little update. And last year, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights jumped right in to help migrants who were stranded at Martha's Vineyard, which is a resort island in Massachusetts, after people working for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis tricked 50 or so of them into getting on a plane in Texas as a publicity stunt. And we heard about that last year. We'll get an update today about that litigation. And a little bit more about Iván Espinoza-Madrigal. Before he worked at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, he was the legal director of the Center for HIV Law and Policy. And before that, he worked at Lands of Legal to address the needs of LGBT and HIV-affected people of color and low-income people, and he focused on marriage equality cases as well. Before that, he handled the immigrants' rights docket for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So today, his colleague, Marian Albert, will give us an overview and update on the Rogers Vineyard litigation, and then he's going to pick up and talk from there about the busing of migrants from the border to big cities and Boston and New York City and the logistical crisis they're experiencing for the government, migrants, the service providers, and hopefully some thoughts about what should be done at this point. So please join me in, and then he's going to introduce Migrant. So please join me in welcoming Iván Espinoza-Madrigal.
Thank you, Professor Marcus. It's always a pleasure to be here with you, and I want to thank the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona for hosting us, and the incredible clinical staff and team for helping us put together this program. And it's great to be here with so many allies, friends, professors, community members, so that we can talk about what we're seeing in the Northeast. As I like to say, what happens at the border doesn't stay at the border. What happens at the border also impacts the interior of the country. And as we continue to see a surge in the number of migrants coming to the United States, it is all the more critical for us to think about the connective tissue between the border and the interior, what's happening in the immigration space, organizations based here in Arizona, and what's happening in the immigration space in organizations in the Northeast and in other places. We're all connected, and not just by the planes and buses that have been leaving from border regions to the Northeast, though that certainly is the most visible manifestation of that nexus. So as Professor Marcus has outlined, we're going to do a brief overview of the Martha's Vineyard case, since that is a unique legal intervention that Lawyers for Civil Rights brought in response to the 2 planes sent by Governor DeSantis a little bit over a year ago. And so we're going to give you a brief overview of that. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Marian Albert to do that, and then picking up from where the planes take off and land, then I'm going to talk about what we're seeing with the busing crisis and how that has manifested in the Northeast. And so I'm going to turn it over to Marian now. Marian Albert is a highly distinguished attorney, just a few years out of law school, so I hope that law students in the audience will be inspired by her incredible accomplishments a few years out. Marian was the first attorney to arrive at Martha's Vineyard when the planes landed, and so she immediately helped put together the pro bono coordination and the community response efforts when the 49 people were left stranded on the tarmac. And so building on that work, she has the federal case filed against DeSantis. She's also done, most recently, a case with the Florence Project to try to preserve the integrity of humanitarian parole, which is a special form of immigration protection available to some people, especially with medical needs or other special needs. And Marian's work is also focused on that, which some people say may be the only, or one of the few avenues of relief available if we move forward with the Trump administration. So what happens with humanitarian parole, humanitarian protection is going to be critical, and Marian has been at the helm of those efforts in partnership and allyship with the Florence Project. And we were just meeting with them yesterday here in Tucson to coordinate efforts as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Marian to talk about Martha's Vineyard, and then you'll hear a little bit more from me.
So, like Iván said, my name is Marian Albert. I have been at LCR now for close to 2 years, and I have to say it's been a really wonderful experience, both growing professionally and personally. But yeah, so to begin, I would like to share a little bit more about the flights that arrived to Martha's Vineyard. If you saw it, if you were following it in the news, this occurred in September of 2022, and what happened was that 2 chartered planes from Texas were flown all the way to Martha's Vineyard. So close to 50 people, like Iván said, 49 migrants, mostly Venezuelan. There was a few from different countries as well, but mostly Venezuelan. And that the morning after they landed in Martha's Vineyard, our office got news of it, and that morning we all immediately got on a Zoom to plan out what we were going to do, because nobody knew what was going on. And so I had the honor to go along with another colleague from our office, and really, which was intimidating, because like this is like the second year I got out of law school. Didn't know really what, I was still trying to understand what I was doing as a lawyer, and throwing me into this like, area where like everyone was in crisis. So it was kind of intimidating, but it was also, I was happy to be there because obviously all of our clients were really shocked. They didn't know what was going on. They had no idea that they were going to be put on an island, isolated from the cities that they were told they were going to be going to. A lot of our clients had already gone through a terrible journey just to get to the U.S. border. Some of our clients were even kidnapped by like cartel members in Mexico. One of our clients had his teeth pulled out by the cartel. So you can only imagine all of the hardship that they had to go through to even reach the U.S. And for them, they thought that they were finally reaching a safe haven once they arrived to the U.S. But unfortunately, obviously that was not what happened. They were very vulnerable. A lot of them didn't have much with them, very few belongings. And so when they were in San Antonio, at that time, because of the surge of migrants that were arriving, San Antonio created a migrant resource center or a welcome center where most migrants were able to stay for 3 days at a maximum. So a lot of our clients had either reached the max 3 days that they were allowed to stay there, and after that they were just wandering the streets because they had nowhere else to go. They had no food. They had nothing. So it was in those streets that the woman who we know now as Huerta, who was Ron DeSantis' recruiter essentially, she was going out into the streets of San Antonio all around that the migrant welcome center, and just approaching our clients and telling them, do you want food? Do you want a free flight to a big city like New York or other different sanctuary cities in the Northeast? And she would be, you're going to get housing, you're going to get help with your immigration case, you're going to get jobs. There was a few families there, and she would tell the families, you're going to receive help with your children's schools, offering them, selling them all the way to in their mind that they needed at that moment, being in such a vulnerable spot. So naturally, a lot of our clients felt comfortable around her. She's also an immigrant. She's Mexican, I believe. And so, she spoke to them in Spanish. She made them feel comfortable. And so as people agreed to get on the flights, she would take our clients to this motel that's far away from the rest of the city. And they had to stay there until basically they recruited the 50 people that would go on the flights. So when that happened, everyone had different stories of where they were supposed to go, but all of the major cities like New York, Boston, I want to say that those were the main cities that people had in mind. These were also migrants that didn't have connections here in the U.S. Most of them, this is the first time someone from their family was traveling to the U.S. So it made them even more vulnerable because they didn't really have any support systems here in the U.S., which I think was also another reason why they trusted Perla and the rest of the people who were coordinating all of these efforts. And so once that happened, they recruited the 50 people. They got them on a flight, and while they were in the air, about to land, maybe 30 minutes before they landed, they were told, well, actually, you're going to go to Martha's Vineyard. And they're like, what's Martha's Vineyard, And they gave them a red folder with some information in it. Maybe some of you have seen that in the news. It included a map that showed them, you are here, and this is Martha's Vineyard and, Boston. And all of them, again, had no idea that they were going to land on an island. So a lot of our clients started freaking out. Naturally, some of our clients said that they thought they were getting deported, that they were getting sent back to Venezuela or wherever their home country was. And then they were also given flyers with information, supposedly information about immigration and handling their cases, but it was for resources that they wouldn't even be eligible for. It would be for people who, had the status of being a refugee. And so none of those benefits or anything were actually, accessible to them. So there was just a lot of lies piled on while they were recruiting them, got them on the planes. And as you might have also seen in the news, they just basically landed, everyone got out, they told them to get on a bus, and then they dropped them off, and that was it. And they had no idea what to do. A lot of them were confused. They started calling Perla, which was the woman that recruited them. And obviously, she didn't answer. She just told them, figure it out, basically, like, you'll be fine. And so, thankfully, the community in Martha's Vineyard was very welcoming and very warm. They somehow found their way to like a service organization like that provides different public services. And the woman there was obviously not expecting them, so they just approached her door, and she also was freaking out because she was like, why is there 50 people just outside my door right now? There was also a huge language barrier, so no one could really communicate with them. But they were able to recruit some of the students from I want to say like a bilingual school maybe, but people who spoke Spanish were able to kind of coordinate those efforts. And they got all of that together really quickly that same night that they had arrived, and moved our clients basically to a church where they created, had beds for them, gave them food and everything. And it was that following morning that I arrived with my colleague, and we also started to connect with other attorneys who were there, who were willing to also volunteer their time to figure out what was going on. And that was also, I think, really empowering and powerful to see that attorneys from all over kind of just came, right? Like there was one attorney who was based out of Martha's Vineyard, but the rest were all working in Boston or in different areas. So they really like went out of their way to come to Martha's Vineyard and help the people that were there. The community also provided them with a lot of resources, which was, again, I think also really great to see, because Ron DeSantis' stuff basically backfired, right? Like he thought they weren't going to welcome the migrants, that, this was going to be, that was his whole point, right, for using these people as political props. But ultimately that didn't end up happening. And so, yeah, so I was there, and I'm interviewing people, and at the same time connecting with people in my office to try to figure out what it is that is going on. Obviously, we knew we had to take a stand, right? Like this was happening in our own backyard, and we were not okay with allowing a politician or an elected official to use human beings as political props. So in a few days after that, we were able to file the class action lawsuit that is still currently pending in federal court in Massachusetts. And yeah, it's been quite a journey. A lot of our clients they had all been processed by immigration, so a lot of them had parole or had been paroled into the country, but they all had appointments to meet with ICE or immigration in different parts of the country. So when they were all put in Martha's Vineyard, they also were, it could have sabotaged their whole immigration case. And so that was also a huge issue, and that it was also great to have all of the attorneys there, because we were all able to coordinate with ICE and different U.S. Immigration agencies to make sure that their appointments were rescheduled, and to be able to move the appointments to Boston. And none of that would have happened, right, if there wasn't people who were willing to take their time and be there. I guess now I can talk a little bit also about some of the claims that we brought against them, against Ron DeSantis, Perla, and the other conspirators that were also involved in the scheme. We have over 10 claims. A lot of them are federal claims and some state law claims. Some, as you can imagine, might be like equal protection claims, Fourth Amendment violations. We included a preemption claim as well, because immigration is the federal government's area. It should not be something that a state government should be involved in. And we also had false imprisonment, civil conspiracies, aiding and abetting, other different types of state law claims. And currently, there's been we've been doing procedural motions basically, and now we're just waiting on the judge to kind of rule on those.
I think that setting it up with the Martha's Vineyard case is important for a couple of reasons. One is that when we've allowed, and by we I mean a very royal we, when we have allowed some state actors to take advantage of the immigration crisis to exacerbate it, I think it has really created the mess that we are now experiencing. Many years ago, earlier on in the Biden administration, I remember talking to somebody in D.C. and they were saying, well, immigration is going to cost us the election, so we want to stay as far away from immigration issues as possible. Right? Immigration issues are the third rail. It's toxic, and the Biden administration is not going to do anything overtly aggressive. And if I look at the landscape now and see how it's really manifested with the flights from Martha's Vineyard, with the busing from the border cities, it has become even more chaotic than what it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I think some of that, of course, is pent-up circumstances from having had the border closed during the pandemic, and circumstances triggered by the pandemic in country conditions, particularly in Central America, in Haiti, in Venezuela, that have really come to the surface and erupted over the past few years, and all of that has also catalyzed the heavy transit of people at the border. So some of it is pandemic-induced or pandemic-related, but other aspects of this I feel are federal neglect. And Marian touched on this when she was talking about the preemption issues. We are dealing with an administration that has been extremely hesitant to assert preemption. And I think precisely because of the themes that were raised earlier in the administration, that if they took a vocal or active position on immigration, that it would be a political backfire. But now we find ourselves in a really thorny situation where, particularly in northern cities and northern states that have typically or historically been pro-immigrant, or at least not anti-immigrant, where many people were eager about providing support services, creating welcoming and affirming spaces, dedicating resources to the incorporation and assimilation, whatever we want to call it, of immigrants into communities. Right? All of that fabric existed, and to some extent continues to exist, but it is frayed now in many northern states, particularly where we come from in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the only right to shelter law in the country. You have to be provided housing if you are homeless. And in the past couple of months, the state has backed away from implementation and enforcement of the right to housing law. It has said that under the current conditions, it cannot provide housing. And that the people coming in are not constituents who need housing. They're not the people from the state that the law was designed to protect. Arguments that even 6 months ago, that 12 months ago, would have been impossible to make or hear in a state like Massachusetts. People would have thought that that was political suicide. You can't say those things out loud. But now we're living in a time period, and it's shifted very abruptly, very quickly, where it is acceptable to say, we will not provide them with housing. We will not provide them with resources. We do not have an obligation to provide them with food. Things that a year ago would have never been questioned, would have never been politically radioactive. But that is the landscape that we're living in now, in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, in so many other places. And why is that? Well, in Massachusetts, we have received, in a span of 6 months, more or less, right? I mean, when the surge started, we can debate. But since the summer, we have received over 10,000 families, not individuals, families. And that has created an unprecedented pressure in the infrastructure that existed and that we were very proud to have, like the right to shelter law and the availability of beds for homeless people. Boston was one of the few cities in the country where there were more than enough beds for the homeless. I mean, it was really an option for people whether they were going to sleep on the street or sleep in a shelter. That was an individual decision because everybody had a bed. And we no longer live in that world in Massachusetts or in New York. And we're even starting to hear extremely concerning, not just rhetoric, but also legal activities. We are hearing significant interest around bringing nuisance litigation against migrants in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, to assert that just their presence is creating a nuisance, is creating foul conditions, and that's something that the state can't allow, and using nuisance type of litigation, nuisance theories, to stop immigrants from living or congregating in certain places in the cities. We're also seeing something very similar to what we were complaining about in the beginning of the migrant crisis, which is the forced busing of migrants. We certainly understand freedom of mobility and the decision to move. Like if you want to move from one place to another, you should be allowed to do that. You shouldn't be forced to do that. You shouldn't be tricked into doing that. It shouldn't be done with misrepresentation, with deceit, with the exploitation that Marian was outlining in Martha's Vineyard. That we oppose. And we've obviously taken legal action to prevent that from happening. But the forced busing of people is something that's certainly concerning. But in New York, among other places, forced busing of people to move them out of the city to upstate areas or other regions is happening. Even in Massachusetts, we are seeing tremendous amount of displacement of migrants arriving in Boston and then having them shuttled to the western part of the state, to cities that are not as full. And so we are seeing techniques being repeated that originally we were objecting to and having them in display in northern states. And as I was alluding to before, the idea of housing, food, and other resources is something that even in Massachusetts we no longer have access to. Lawyers for Civil Rights, my organization, filed a lawsuit in the fall to enforce the right to housing law. We identified a series of people who were homeless, including migrants, and we filed in state court saying that the state had an obligation to house them and had failed to do so. And it was an emergency lawsuit. It moved extremely quickly. Within 48 hours, we were in a preliminary injunction hearing, and we had a really bad draw, which is rare in the Northeast. But we had a bad draw, and the judge said, basically, who am I to tell the state what to do? Who am I to tell the state that what they're doing is wrong? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, you're a judge, that's what you do. But like, the judge was very adamant about like, I don't have the authority to tell the state that they need to house these people. Silly you. And so we actually got a really bad decision saying that the state had discretion to implement the right to housing law. Which that kind of means that we don't have the right to housing. Yeah. It's kind of like if the state wants to give you housing, it will. So now that's what we have. And the state legislature, which for better or worse tends to be progressive, was appalled, as everybody was. I mean, we were appalled by how this transpired in court. And the state immediately appropriated $250 million to an emergency fund to expand housing. And so it was one of those things where we lost in court, but we won in a weird way, which is an important lesson, right? Like, never put your eggs in one basket. Like, make sure that you're cultivating multiplicity of approaches, because you never know where the victory might lie. Even if you have a really strong legal theory, it could fail. And so we ended up winning in the legislature the relief that we were not able to secure in court, and $250 million was appropriated. The problem, of course, is that with 10,000 families coming, and the number of families, the number of buses arriving each day. I mean, dozens of buses are arriving each day. The housing situation continues to be incredibly tenuous, right? So you house the people that arrived yesterday, and what do you do with the people who arrived today? And people can't cycle in and out of the housing shelters because they don't have work. So why don't they have work? This takes me back to the federal issue, because the federal government has not expedited the resolution of many of these applications, and people are just in limbo. One of the things that we did in Massachusetts, Marian actually participated in this clinic. There was an employment authorization clinic organized by the state. Before the clinic, out of the about 10,000 people we have in the state, 10,000 immigrants, families we have in the state, only 813 people had an employment authorization card. 813. After the clinic, the state was able to secure close to 3,000 employment authorization cards. Right? Like, I mean, talk about impact. And showing that with dedicated resources, we can have a direct intervention and activate these people into the economic space. These people want to work. You know, their ability to work is what is in question, right? Like, can they work legally? And one of the hard things about this is also the mismatch that the pandemic has created in the economy. You know, just in Massachusetts alone, we have over 200,000 jobs available today. The number is actually like 228,000. Obviously, like, these migrants can be plugged into those positions, but there is a tremendous mismatch. What we need might be, for example, nurses, but maybe the people coming in are not trained in nursing. Or what we need are home health aides, because we have an aging population, we have people affected by COVID. And these are not necessarily the skills that are represented in the pool of people coming. But it is, I think, critical for us to be thinking about the migrant crisis as an opportunity. And I know you may disagree with me on this, but we cannot think about it as these are people that will forever need shelter, food, and resources. That's not the case. When you are able to get these people some type of immigration protection, some type of employment authorization, some type of skills training, we are able to create pathways that lift all boats and that help the economies in our states. And I think that's an important piece that has been missing, especially, well, not just in the north, but here as well. Like the idea that we don't want these people here. These people are moochers. These people are a drain. When in reality, we are missing a vast opportunity to channel them into opportunities that exist economically. But it takes a lot of effort to do that. It takes a lot of effort. It takes the federal government functioning to be able to actually process those applications on a timely basis. It takes the ability for the state to provide some temporary shelter while people are activated economically. But all of this needs to work better, needs to work in sync. But this is not rocket science. Like, we can figure this out. It just hasn't happened that way. One thing that Marian said, how powerful the community support was in Martha's Vineyard, is something that I really want to underscore. It wasn't just Marian and me in Martha's Vineyard. It wasn't just a church and its basement. It was neighbors coming with canned goods and winter jackets. It was a bank coming in being like, we're going to open up bank accounts so that if you're getting handouts, you could put them in a bank account so that you can then make money transfers through a financial institution if you need them. And when you got jobs, you could deposit your money there. So even the private sector was activated in how we respond to the migrant crisis. The state came and enrolled people in our what's called Mass Health, which is kind of like a charity healthcare system that we have. But like, the point is, government, philanthropy, the private sector, public interest organizations, nonprofit organizations, all came together to advance the interest of the 49 people in Martha's Vineyard. And the problem with how we are receiving the 10,000 families is that connective tissue has not been recreated. Where is the bank opening up bank accounts? Where is the registration table to put kids in school? Where is the registration table to facilitate medical appointments? Where are the job training programs that were basically connected to the Martha's Vineyard migrants so that they could all get work? Many of them incorporated into the tourist industry in Martha's Vineyard to change sheets, laundry, janitors, landscaping, whatever jobs they have. And, I mean, all of this, it's clear to me that with Martha's Vineyard, we achieved a level of coordination that is much needed and can be scaled up to be able to protect the 10,000. But we have not achieved that. I remember recently, right before we filed a lawsuit, because we are in a liberal state, right? So we have a relatively good relationship with the governor. I spoke to the governor and I was like, we're going to sue. And the governor said, well, you do you. But, and she was right, because it failed. But like, she said to me, you do you, but I want you to know that we have left no stone unturned. And I said to the governor, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true, because you haven't been able to deploy this same resource and network that existed back in the fall of 2022. Like, we haven't seen that. And the governor was like, well, you know, we tried our best. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, but that's not the solution. Like, have you actually put a call out for the private sector to help? And what was interesting is that after we failed in court, because it was all over the news, and then the appropriation happened for the $250 million, then United Way came about saying, like, we want to help support the migrants and create a program on United Way for workplace training and integration. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, why wasn't United Way activated 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 4 months ago? Shouldn't that be the role of government, to get the United Way to do that? And why is it that it took months after people were just sitting there unable to work to organize the employment authorization clinic that Marian went to? You know, and so we need to be a lot more strategic and proactive about how we're dealing with this. We can't just sit there and say, these people are moochers, and these people are takers, and these people need support, if we're not creating the infrastructure to exit them out of that system and to integrate them into our economy. And that leads me to right before I go to Q&A, the political landscape, right? Like, we're about to go into an election year where immigration is going to be a decisive and divisive topic. And I think it's really important for us to think about the importance of compromise. Because clearly being polarized into, you know, we're doing it this way, we're doing it that way, we're going to be anti-immigrant, we're going to be pro-immigrant, it's not helping anybody, right? Like, we need to find a way to make sure that we have compromises that center the economy, that center humanitarian protections like asylum and humanitarian parole. And so we need to think about that. Right before I started talking here, I was meeting with Professor Marcus, who was saying something needs to change. And I couldn't agree more. We need to reshuffle the deck. But reshuffling the deck doesn't just mean building a border wall. Doesn't just mean saying no to them. We need to reshuffle the deck all around how we're thinking about it from a local, state, federal level, and how we're interfacing with them as public interest organizations, as state agencies. We need to reshuffle the deck fully. And that's something that I don't think we're going to be able to accomplish between now and November. But that's really what the path forward is here. You know, the path forward here is all hands on deck. And I know that sounds like more work, like I'm assigning you more work. But I think it's less work when we think about it, like, we're all in this together, right? Like, it wasn't me registering people for healthcare or school or opening up those bank accounts. It was people who were in that arena, right? Like, we did the legal work. We did that legal piece. And so I think it's important for us to divide and conquer this in ways that I don't think we've been able to. And just a movement of people, whether it's from Juma to DC, as we've seen, or whether it's from Texas to Boston, is not the answer. And certainly not moving them from New York City to Albany or from Boston to Springfield. Like, that's not the answer. Like, we need to think about this, as Professor Marcus was articulating this morning, from a how do we do things differently. And so with that, I'll open it up to Q&A because I think that positions us for a robust discussion. Please.
Sorry, I have a mini rant.
A mini rant.
A mini rant. Much
This is
in,
Rachel, she's an immigration attorney.
much in the way that the catastrophe of Ira happened under the Clinton administration, we're seeing not a compromise between two polarized things here. We're seeing a complete abdication on the part of the Democratic Party for any kind of useful pro-immigrant work. And I blame the Democratic Party at its core, because when Trump was in office, horrible things happened. But horrible things are happening now, and nobody cares because we have a Democrat in the White House. How to solve that? Only through social movement. That's how schools got desegregated, not from Brown versus Board of Education. It was from black children getting hosed down with fire hoses. Anyway, sorry, that was my mini rant. Now I have an actual question. My question is, I don't understand the truth of what's happening at the border. CBP continues to say, oh, we have record numbers, et cetera, but I know that a lot of that is because of the complete closure of the border during Title 42, and also the metering that's going on with the CBP 1 Act. Is it really what they say, a record number of people or not? I can't figure out what the truth is.
I think both of those points are very well taken. You called it application. I call it preemption not being enforced. I mean, right? Like we could think about it and talk about it in different ways, but it's the same thing. Like when we have the federal government not stepping in, that is an application. That is them not exercising the authority that they have to regulate immigration and to occupy the space as they're designed to be in our federal system, right? The feds do some stuff, the states do others. Immigration, whether we like it or not, is an exclusively federal matter. But you would be hard-pressed to think that over the past few years. I mean, everybody does what they want with a migrant, right? Like whether you're a mayor, a sheriff, a governor, whether you put them on a plane or a bus, whether you just leave them on a street, it's like a complete lack of coordination. And that is dangerous. That's dangerous because it makes us unsafe to not have the coordination of this. And so you called it abdication. I call it the failure to properly occupy the space and to assert the preemption that they have. And that's a serious thing. Now, for your question about what's happening at the border, I think that's a really good question. And one thing for us is that we always have to take all of this with a grain of salt. And I think about when they say the most number of people apprehended in one day. And then the next day, it's like the most number of people apprehended ever today, more than yesterday. And it's like, well, those were the same people trying to cross again. You know? And so it's like, if you think about it that way, it's like, I get it. Yes, you're out there spending resources in the apprehension process, and that you are encountering, let's say, 100 people, and that's a lot of people. But those are the same 100 people you're encountering the next day. So it's not like 200 people showed up at the border. It's 100 people, and you just keep pushing them out. And so we have to take some of those stats with a grain of salt. And so what you're saying, I think, is important. However, I do feel that there has been a surge. And I think that surge is most evident in some of the dynamics we were illustrating, for example, with the scarcity of shelter beds in northern cities. And so I think we definitely are seeing a surge. I think the surge, you mentioned the closure of the border with Title 42. I agree with you. I think we're just seeing the pent-up demand from years when no one was crossing. That's happening now. And we have to also think about conditions in their home countries. Marian and I were in El Salvador less than a year ago. And the situation in El Salvador is tough. Violence against women, it's tough. Like, we actually went to the home of 2 kids that we represent. The mother, a Salvadoran immigrant woman, went missing over a year ago. Missing women's report went unheeded. Point is, nobody has found her. We realized she has 2 children in El Salvador. We actually went to visit them. And when we arrived at their home, it was abject poverty. I mean, conditions that I didn't even really understood, and I'm from Latin America, understood that people were living in. And so when you compound that level of deprivation with violence, with all of the different things that are happening, that is a toxic mix that is making people flee, that is making people leave. And so that also raises questions about what are we doing as the United States to make sure that if we're sending support, whether it's military or otherwise, to El Salvador, where's that going to? If people are coming in large numbers, right? Like, again, the reshuffle needs to be systemic and structural. And so I think I get your point about can we trust the numbers. I think objectively the numbers are higher. I think we also have to take it with a grain of salt. But the last thing on the numbers is I think of immigration as ebbs and flows, right? Like 3 years ago we didn't have this. 5 years ago we didn't have this. Maybe in 3 years we won't have this. I don't know. But like I never think of immigration as like there are 10,000 people now and there will always be 10,000 people. Like that's not the way it works. Immigration is nuanced, right? And those of you who work in this space know that because you represent a lot more individual clients than we do. But I think that's an important element too. Even if we admit and concede that we happen to be at a high point right now, I don't think that means that in 6 months the same thing will happen. There could be many different things that happen. And so we don't know. So I take that also with a grain of salt. Just because I'm conceding that the numbers are high and have been high for the last 6 months doesn't mean that they will continue to be high for years. And so that's a balance there. Marian, anything on this?
No, I think that was very complete.
We'll go there, then here.
Yeah, so I was on Cape Cod a few years ago, and I talked to like servers and a lot of students, and they were like all temporary immigrant workers, and the community seemed like very supportive of that. So it's interesting to hear that Massachusetts kind of got the disdain for the migrants that are coming in now. Like, do you think it's because they're not temporary, or I just love for you to talk about that again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some of the points that Iván raised earlier, I think it's just because the high increase of numbers in the last year or 6 months has also like revealed a lot of like the problems in other, infrastructure in the state, right? Like housing has always been an issue, but now it's like in everyone's face because there's 10,000 families now that also need housing. So I think that the scarcity of resources really has, I think, turned some of those people who you would think are liberals or are liberals to start to express some more anti-immigrant or not as welcoming sentiments to that.
I think there's also an element of race to be, to call a spade. We have a system where I think we have a lot of data points to show where Black Haitian migrants, for example, are not treated the same way that a Ukrainian migrant would be treated. And that's for a host of reasons, for race, for language. We talk a lot, in Boston, we have the 3rd largest Haitian American community in the United States, after Miami and Brooklyn, which is kind of random how they ended up there. But anyway, we also have one of the largest resilient populations in the country, so it's interesting demographics in Boston. And so when we talk to the Haitian migrants, like they describe really terrible experiences when they're being processed by CBP at the border, where by now, for better or worse, there are people who speak Spanish, and so if you need to use the bathroom, you say baño. People understand baño, okay, bathroom. But like try saying it in Haitian Creole and see who understands, right? And so like those things are real, and so the unavailability of services starts, as soon as you step in with the government not being able to understand you or provide you with what you need, and that flows. Like, we were just out in Springfield, Massachusetts, meeting with community groups who were telling us, there are migrants coming in for the first time in this area who speak Haitian Creole, because you're usually in Boston. And so we don't have anybody who speaks Haitian Creole here. So I have no idea what these people need, and who am I supposed to go to? And so, like, there's that. And so I think when you compound race with language, with other identity factors and demographics, like, that matters too. But I think what Marian says is obviously like the bulk of it, and then we have the underlying demographic issues.
You don't have to turn it all the way around. My question's not too long. I'm just starting an immigration course, and it's not something I have a ton of background in, but we have noted several times that recent immigration policies are in violation of various international treaties. I know, for example, we talked about how the transit rule was a violation of UN refugee provisions, and I'm wondering, I don't know, I have a sort of cynical view of international law that it never seems to really be meaningfully enforced, and I'm wondering if it plays any role in the humanitarian work that your field does, or do your field just kind of throw up our hands and go, well, nobody listens to it?
We don't really traffic in international law.
Right.
And I think that's just because the culture, like, we're not, as a legal system, we're taught to use federal law, use state law, right? And so it's challenging. Like, we have not, we've had some curiosity in moving in that direction, particularly as we start looking at some of the problems that are not just domestic but are regional in nature, like what happens to migrants. Marian mentioned the guy who was rendered toothless when he was abducted and tortured in Mexico. He was kidnapped, and they kept telling him, you have to give us the name of somebody in the United States who could send money to release you. And he didn't have anybody, and they just kept pulling teeth, and then he was rendered toothless and then thrown off a moving vehicle, left for dead. That's one of our Martha's Vineyard clients. And so when you think about, like, these journeys and the humanitarian implications of the journeys, not just in the United States, but like what happens to them in Mexico and in other places, like, we have thought more about using international instruments to add more texture or different, like I was saying before, cultivate multiple avenues for victories. But it's tough because that's not really how we are trained, and that's not really how we think, and that's not really how we file cases and frame relief. And so for us, that's been an interesting area to think about, and possibly an area of expansion. But I agree that that's an really untapped area of law. It is how immigration practices dovetail or not, clash or cohere with international law. And so I think that's an area ripe for further investigation and work, for sure.
Thank you.
So one preemption issue that has been in the news a lot lately is you don't have to film me.
Do you want me to not?
I would love for you to not. Is the Texas state law criminalizing the border crossings. And some of the more cynical views that I've seen on it have basically been saying that they're just trying to get Arizona and the United States overturned and establish a level of state authority over immigration law that has never been recognized. So I was wondering if you could comment on specifically that situation in Texas and what you think it says about the current landscape for preemption and your future predictions for how that case is going to play out.
I agree with you. I worked on the SB 1070 case when I was a baby lawyer, and it was actually the first time that I had come to Arizona. And I remember thinking to myself, this is great, with something like this settled, this means that we won't see anything like this ever again when you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And I think there are a couple of different things. We can't discount the composition of the Supreme Court in that assessment. Everything is up for grabs. I mean, in Texas, I've even heard about revisiting Plyler veto to deny public school education to undocumented children. And so when even Plyler veto something as fundamental as just going to public school for free is in the chopping block, then you know that there are forces at play that are trying to revisit what some of us would like to hope is well-established precedent, but clearly it's not. And I think the composition of the Supreme Court will play a role in that. Marian, comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really up in the air. I mean, even with our case, we've been waiting now for quite some time to hear back from the judge, and the court's been silent for more than, I don't know if I want to say more than 6 months, but maybe that's just in my head. But yeah, I mean, we don't know. Yeah, it's still up in the air.
Yeah, for sure. And we're hopeful that now that DeSantis exited the election, that the court may actually feel even more comfortable to rule. So we'll have to see.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
We should break because it's 1 o'clock. Oh no, we're till 1. We're good till 1:15. I just saw people leaving, so I thought people who need to leave are free to leave, but we're good here till 1:15.
So we can take maybe another question or two. If people have questions, okay, over here.
I have a question for Marian about specifically what's going on with the folks on Martha's Vineyard now. Do they live there still? Is the church there still involved? Do they work here or have they moved on? What's going on Martha's Vineyard?
Sure. So, I mean, shortly after they arrived in Martha's Vineyard, I want to say like after a few days, the state basically moved them from Martha's Vineyard to a military camp, and they were there for 2 weeks, and then from there, some people were able to get housing through the right to shelter, mostly just the families, which were 2, I believe, or 3, or maybe a few more. And then the rest were just kind of like on their own. Thankfully, because of the people who volunteered and were there, they were able to open bank accounts, and they all have pro bono immigration attorneys to help them on their cases. So all of that is well on its way. And you may also have seen in the news that they're all eligible for new visas. So that's also another option that, along with asylum, because not all of them qualify for asylum based on their individual circumstances. But thankfully they both have that available to them. But other than that, I mean, a lot of them have moved to different areas of Massachusetts. Some of them have moved out of state, trying to just, find better opportunity. Because like Iván said, sometimes they move people into random places in the state, places that might not have a lot of people who speak Spanish or a lot of resources that might be helpful to them. So some families have moved out of the state, some have gone to Michigan, some to New York. But most of them are still there. There's a group of maybe like 5 or 6 who remain on the island. They were a family from Martha's Vineyard who had volunteered when they arrived, opened the doors to them, and they've been there since they arrived and are working, in restaurants or things like that, obviously under the table. Some of them have already received their work permits, which is great, but inconsistencies with the immigration system. Some of them are still waiting. But yeah, they're kind of like all over a little bit. Yeah. The church no longer involved either, but it's still obviously a great connection for them.
Professor.
Okay, I'm gonna go over here because if anybody wants to watch this, it's good for them to see the question. So my question is, can you talk about the representation that's happening? Like some areas have immigration representation. Some areas have immigration representation that's
Like right to counsel.
like right to counsel, it's in New York City, right? Don't you have the right to counsel? And so that system clearly has got to be overwhelmed. I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on there, but also what's going on in Boston.
Mm-hmm. As Marian said, we did a lot of work to get every Martha's Vineyard regular employer, and that's worked well. And in some ways, right, again, it's kind of like the issue of how do you scale up from there to provide representation for thousands of people. And that's been harder. I think the way the system has worked the best that I've seen it so far has been in the creation of these mass clinics where people are coming in to do change of addresses, change of venue, employment authorization. We actually organized one in Boston for Venezuelans to apply for TPS. And so we had dozens and dozens of people come in, both to help them fill out their TPS and then people who needed the TPS support. And so we've seen that model, just the clinical model, be very useful, but I completely agree that the system has not been ideal. We have tons and tons of requests for free legal assistance. I mean, tons. Each day we're bombarded with many requests. Many of them also not just coming from individuals, but coming from institutions. So a church might say, we have 5 people who need asylum assistance or who need TPS. And so we try as much as possible to coordinate, but this is one area that has been extremely frustrating. We do not have any type of right to counsel law in Massachusetts. The state does have a small fund that it uses to pay, at least partially pay, for pro bono attorneys, but the resources are very limited. We do not have anything like what New York City has, and my understanding from talking to our counterparts in New York is that they're completely overwhelmed. I mean, the system has essentially collapsed because of the severe demand. But I think I try to think about this as bite-sized pieces. Like, let's just get these people through their change of venue application. Let's get the people through an employment authorization document. You know, let's take it as bite sizes, because we are not going to be able to provide asylum or pro bono attorneys for people, for thousands of people. It's just not possible. And we have been trying as much as possible to activate people in those discrete pieces. Like, we have TPS registration, let's do that, and let's dedicate a day where what we're doing is TPS registration. So that's the model we have been using, but the representation piece is huge. We've been pressing the state to expand the fund that it has. The fund has been very small. In past years, just like $1 million is available, which, when you think about the state of how many people need right now, just the state of matters, is just completely insufficient. We have been thinking about also doing a series of immigration clinics, so having the lawyers go to shelter sites, since people don't have transportation, right? They can't move. Having immigration attorneys volunteer for 2-3 hour blocks at the shelters and just bringing them there, having them do initial immigration assessments. And so we're trying to think through different permutations of what this looks like, but the bottom line is that demand far outweighs our capacity. Demand far outweighs our capacity.
And just to add to that, I think too, from the employment authorization clinic that I did, something that was also really helpful and that needs to be activated more, I think, is law students, right? Like, there was a lot of law students who volunteered there and were able to help. Yeah, so like, right, looking at everyone here, it's so important, right, because it really helped with the numbers. A lot of the attorneys who were there were immigration attorneys, but, you know, there was people there who didn't necessarily have all that background, and they just helped with other stuff that they could help with, right? But as law students, you have some foundational knowledge about that. And, you know, like, the immigration attorneys that were at that clinic the clinic lasted for, I think, 2 weeks. And usually it was the same number of attorneys who were constantly volunteering there, right? So you can imagine how exhausting that is. So the numbers are really like important, and if law students are able to help with that, I think we really need to utilize that more.
When we had now that you're doing a call to action, when we had our TPS clinic, we got swamped at one point towards the end of the day. Like everybody was coming out from work, and we had a good pace. We thought, oh, we're good, we're keeping up with the flow. All of a sudden, like 5 o'clock, 5:30 hit, and we just got slammed. And then we had volunteers, not lawyers, not law students. We just had community members who started helping us with the TPS applications. Like they would start pre-screening people. They were like, okay, so where's the form? We'll start filling it out in paper. So we just had community members at the clinic starting to help us out. I mean, so what Marian's saying about law students being especially able to help, look, like there were people who have no training in anything who are doing this and just like, I'm here, use me. Whether it was to translate, whether it was to help collate documents that you need as supporting documents for an application. I mean, it was just incredibly powerful to see the home stretch of that clinic be basically everybody who's in this room is doing something right now to help with the TPS applications. And that's been our experience at these clinics. And so that model for us has worked, but obviously the idea is how do we scale up? How do we address not just hundreds, but how do we address thousands? And we've been in coordination with pro bono managers of large law firms, but we need a lot more support. Like this isn't the type of thing where like one big firm is going to take this on. Like we need a lot more coordination. There was something here, I believe. Another hand up. Okay. Thank you. Oh, okay. Final question.
Yeah. So, sort of summarizing what I'm hearing, just because I'm sure I'm missing a part of it, is that because right now we are in an increase of the number of people that need assistance, one of the things that not only lawyers, but business people, and just everyone in the community needs to do is we need to find some way to handle that surge, whether it's temporary or it's going to go on for a little while. I was also coming in sort of hoping that there's all these court cases that are also just going to deal with that surge, and it's going to make it not a problem. It doesn't really sound like that's the case, is it? Like it's really, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's going to take people and resources to do that. Hopefully, either we get better at it, we get more people to do it, or the surge stops and then everything gets back to normal. Because I have to imagine right now, if you're putting people across the border back, if you're moving people from one camp to a hotel to this, that is wasted time, resources. That's where a lot of the injustice is happening. Just making these people's lives unbearable. They're not able to become part of society. And changing the laws is not going to fix that. It's work.
And coordination. I think that's critical. Like the coordination of efforts. Like we need the feds to expedite the immigration applications, expedite the employment authorization cards. That gets people into the workplace, right? Like we need a flow chart because we don't even have a flow chart, and we need that flow chart to work like clockwork. And right now we don't have that. And it's going to take more than the feds, though I think the feds should play a very important role in the coordination. That is a missing piece, even under Biden. And so yes, to your point, I think, but I'm hopeful. I am. The way you wrapped up, you seemed a little bit pessimistic, but like I'm hopeful. I think we have a key opportunity here, and I think we can leverage this instead of looking at it as a resource drain to become an economic advantage. But it will take a lot more coordination for us to get people that are situated, to get efficiencies into the system. But yes, your assessment, I think, is on point, but I have a more optimistic view of it. And I think the more we stress the need for coordination and demand it and contribute to that ourselves, I think the better.
And that's a great note to end on. Optimism.